Take off the scarf." The command sliced through the ballroom like a knife, and every conversation died instantly. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, scattering gold light across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Somewhere a string quartet kept playing, valiantly, foolishly, as if music alone could pretend the room hadn't gone cold. But no one danced anymore. Nearly 50 of Korea's wealthiest families sat frozen around white linen tables, every eye fixed on the trembling woman standing near the back of the room, half shadowed by a pillar as though she'd hoped the marble might swallow her whole. Precious Adiz lowered her eyes. "Excuse me." Her father's jaw tightened, the muscle ticking beneath skin that had spent 30 years learning how to look respectable in rooms exactly like this one. "I said take it off." Her fingers rose instinctively to the silk scarf covering the left side of her face, fingers that had performed this same small defensive motion 10,000 times since she was a child. "No," she whispered, so quietly only she and the ache in her own chest could hear it. Her oldest sister rolled her eyes with theatrical boredom. "Oh, please. It's not like she'll suddenly become pretty if she keeps it on." The younger sister laughed loud enough for the whole hall to hear. "At least let the businessman know what he's rejecting." A ripple of laughter spread across the room, polite and cruel in the way only old money manages to be. Precious swallowed the lump rising in her throat and reminded herself, the way she always did, that humiliation was simply weather. It passed. It always passed. This wasn't a family dinner. It was an auction dressed in candlelight and string quartets so that no one would have to call it what it was. Every influential family in Seoul had brought an unmarried daughter tonight, each one polished and rehearsed, hoping to catch the attention of a single man. Kang Tae-hyun, 32, head of the Kang family, the most powerful man in Seoul's shadow economy, the kind of man whose name was spoken carefully even by people who had never met him. Cold, brilliant, dangerous, the kind of man entire boardrooms went silent for, the kind whose enemies disappeared quietly and were never spoken of again. He never smiled, never dated, never apologized. And today, after years of refusing every proposal that crossed his desk, he had made one impossible announcement. "I'm looking for a wife." Every mother in Seoul had nearly fainted on the spot. Every father had suddenly remembered, with great urgency, that he had beautiful daughters. Precious had wished, quite sincerely, that she'd remembered she had the flu. Her father leaned closer, his voice dropping to the low, dangerous register he used when his patience was a candle burning down to the wick. "Take it off." She untied the scarf slowly, the silk slipping from her fingers, like something letting go of her at last. Gasps rippled around the ballroom. The pale scar stretched from her temple to her cheek, not grotesque, never grotesque, but impossible to look past once you'd seen it. A permanent signature written across her face by a night she had spent years trying not to remember. Someone whispered, "What a shame." Another replied, "Just loud enough. She would have been beautiful." Her father sighed, the picture of long-suffering patience. "That's why she's still unmarried." Precious's lips twitched despite everything. "Oh, don't worry, father. I'm sure I'll survive without becoming someone else's problem." Several guests coughed to swallow their laughter. Her father glared at her, the look he gave her every single time her mouth outran her caution. "You always have something to say. I inherited that from you." Even one of the waiters, passing with a tray of champagne, very nearly lost his composure. Across the ballroom, Kang Tae-hyun watched everything, his face a study in perfect stillness. His assistant leaned toward him, voice low. "Sir, shall we move to the next family?" "No." The assistant blinked. "No. I haven't started." He rose from his chair, and every other chair in the room scraped backward as 50 families scrambled to their feet at once. The atmosphere turned suffocating in an instant. Women adjusted the lines of their dresses. One touched up her lipstick using her phone screen as a mirror. Another let her handkerchief fall, with theatrical precision, directly in his path. Tae-hyun walked past it without so much as a glance. She stared after him, seriously. The next daughter offered a smile so sweet it could have curdled milk. "I've admired you for years." Silence. He kept walking. Another stepped directly into his path. "My father's company could be very useful too." He simply walked around her, and she looked, for one unguarded moment, personally offended by gravity itself. Precious watched this parade of practiced rejection with something between pity and amusement, and murmured to no one in particular, "He doesn't need a wife." Her cousin, seated beside her, leaned in. "What?" "He needs a GPS. He's walking past everyone." Her cousin burst into a startled laugh and quickly disguised it as a cough. Even one of the bodyguards near the door had to look away to hide a smile. And then Tae-hyun stopped, directly in front of Precious. She looked behind herself, certain someone important must be standing there. There was no one, only a flower arrangement. White peonies arranged with mathematical precision. She pointed at her own chest. "Me." He nodded once. "You." She glanced left, then right, then back at him, utterly unconvinced. "You've definitely skipped breakfast." Another ripple of shocked laughter moved through the hall. Nobody joked with Kang Tae-hyun. His assistant began, somewhere in the back of his mind, silently drafting his letter of resignation. Precious folded her arms. "Look, sir, if this is some kind of charity event, I'm not interested." "You think I'm pitying you? Aren't you?" He stepped closer, near enough that his next words were meant for her alone. "I hate pity." "So do I." For the first time all evening, something flickered behind his eyes. Interest. Real interest, unguarded and entirely unfamiliar on a face that had perfected the art of giving nothing away. He looked directly at her scar, not away from it, not through it, the way every other person in that room had managed, but at it openly, the way one studies something worth understanding. "What happened?" Her answer came without flinching. "I survived." Nothing else. No explanation, no performance of grief for an audience that had never deserved one. Just 2 words, and something inside him quietly, permanently shifted. Everyone in the room waited for him to move on, the way he had moved on from every daughter before her. Instead, he extended his hand. "I've made my choice." The ballroom exploded into noise. "What?" "It can't be her." "Has he lost his mind?" Her father stumbled forward, color draining from his face. "Mr. Kang, surely you mean one of my other daughters?" Tae-hyun never looked away from Precious. "I said," he repeated, taking her hand in his, "I've made my choice." Her sisters turned pale. One nearly dropped her champagne flute. The other whispered, half in horror, half in disbelief, "She's bewitched him." Precious stared down at their joined hands, then up at his face, searching for the trick, the catch, the punchline that would make sense of any of this. "You know," she said dryly, "this is usually the part where people ask me on a date first." For half a second, the corner of Tae-hyun's mouth nearly moved. Almost. His assistant's eyes went wide. Did the boss almost smile? Before anyone could recover from that small, impossible miracle, Precious's father stepped between them, panic cracking his voice wide open. "You don't understand, Mr. Kang. There are things about her you don't know." His hands trembled at his sides. "She has never been easy. She has never been the daughter I hoped for." The entire ballroom fell into stunned, airless silence. Precious's smile vanished like a candle pinched out between 2 fingers, the old familiar shame rising hot and fast beneath her ribs. And Kang Tae-hyun's eyes turned dangerously, unmistakably cold. For one long moment, Precious felt like a child again, standing in a doorway while neighbors murmured behind their hands and no one quite met her eyes. She had built an entire life out of learning how to survive that particular silence, The silence that came right before someone decided what kind of person she was without ever asking her. She had learned to smile through it, to joke through it, to walk through rooms full of people who flinched at her face as though flinching cost her nothing in return. But standing there now, with Kong Tae-hyun's hand still warm against hers and her father's words hanging in the chandelier light like smoke that refused to clear, she realized she had never once stopped bracing for exactly this moment. She had simply gotten very, very good at pretending otherwise. The ballroom remained frozen, the silence so total that Precious could hear her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs. No one breathed. No one moved. Only she did, slipping her hand slowly out of Kong Tae-hyun's. "See," she said, summoning a bitter little smile from somewhere deep and well-practiced. "I told you choosing me comes with free family commentary." No one laughed this time. Her father's voice trembled with something that might have been guilt dressed up as righteousness. "She's difficult. She always has been." Whispers moved across the room like sparks catching dry grass. I knew there had to be a reason. Poor Mr. Kong. Cancel the engagement. Precious closed her eyes. Even after all these years, the words still landed exactly where they always did, in the soft, unhealed place beneath her ribs. She had gotten used to strangers staring at her scar. She had never once gotten used to her father's words. Before she could find her voice, a deep voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. Enough. Every head in the room turned toward Kong Tae-hyun. His expression hadn't changed, cold, unreadable, dangerously calm. But the air around him had, the temperature of the room dropping several degrees in an instant. He looked at Precious's father the way a judge looks at a man who has already lost the case. "You've spoken." A pause, heavy enough to crush stone. "Now I'm speaking." "I asked one question," he said. "What happened to her?" Silence. "I didn't ask for your opinion of her character." Her father swallowed hard, his composure crumbling in real time in front of 50 of his closest rivals. I was only trying to be honest. With her or with yourself?" Nothing. Tae-hyun took one slow step forward. "A father who truly loved his daughter," he said, voice never rising, never needing to, wouldn't need an entire ballroom to remind her of her worst day. Not a single person in that gilded room had an answer. Precious looked up at him, startled. He had noticed. He had seen, in the space of one evening, what her own family had refused to see in years. Her father stammered something incoherent. "You've embarrassed her enough," Tae-hyun said simply. "Today's entertainment is over." He turned to her. "Let's go." She blinked, just like that. "Unless you enjoy this." She glanced around at the hundreds of judgmental faces, the half-hidden smirks, the pity dressed up as concern. Fair point. As they crossed toward the exit, one of her sisters rushed in front of them, flashing her brightest, most rehearsed smile. "Mr. Kong, I'm actually much better suited for someone like you. I know how to behave in rooms like this." Precious sighed dramatically. "Oh, good. Problem solved." She stepped aside with a small, gracious wave, as if presenting a prize. Her sister beamed, victorious, reaching out to rest a manicured hand against his arm. "I could be exactly what you need," she purred, leaning in with practiced confidence. Tae-hyun looked down at the hand on his sleeve as though it were something he'd found on his shoe. "I doubt that." He stepped neatly out of her reach and continued walking, not even slowing his stride by a fraction. The smile froze on the woman's face like a photograph nobody wanted developed. Precious leaned toward her as she passed. That had to hurt. Even one of the photographers near the door snorted before he could stop himself. Outside, a black luxury sedan waited at the curb, engine humming low. A bodyguard opened the rear door. Precious stopped, staring at the car with the particular suspicion of someone who has never trusted anything that looked too perfect. "You know," she said. "What?" "I've never sat inside something this expensive. What do I do if I accidentally breathe too hard?" He raised one eyebrow, the closest thing to genuine surprise his face had offered all evening. Try not to scratch it. Oh, she nodded gravely. I'll just scratch you instead. His assistant looked sideways at the bodyguards. Did she just threaten the boss? One of them whispered back, awed. I think she did. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, Taehyun very nearly smiled again. Inside the car, silence settled over them like a held breath. Precious watched the city lights blur past the window, gold and red smeared across glass. The kind of view she'd only ever seen from the back of a bus before tonight. After several minutes, she spoke. So, are you always this talkative? I speak when necessary. She nodded slowly. That explains why your assistant looks chronically stressed. The driver, who was in fact the assistant, said nothing, which she took as confirmation. A few moments later, she turned toward him properly, studying his profile in the passing light. You really think I'm difficult? No, he answered immediately, without the half-second hesitation most people gave even to questions they were certain of. You didn't even hesitate. I watched your face all evening. And people who are actually difficult enjoy being cruel. You flinch every time someone else is. He looked directly into her eyes, the way almost no one ever did anymore, as if her scar were simply part of the landscape of her and not the whole map. Your father called you difficult. I think he meant honest, and found that inconvenient. Her throat tightened painfully. Nobody in years had ever said anything like that to her. Not once, not even gently, not even by accident. She looked quickly away, toward the window, toward the blur of a city she suddenly couldn't see clearly through the sting in her eyes. You don't know me. No, I don't. But I intend to. For some reason that frightened her far more than any accusation ever had. An hour later, he brought her to one of Seoul's most exclusive restaurants, the kind with no sign outside, no menu in the window, nothing to announce itself except the quiet certainty of money and the particular hush of staff who knew exactly whose table this was. The manager nearly bowed to the floor. Mr. Kong. Taehyun nodded once. The private room. As they walked in, Precious opened the leather-bound menu, scanned the elegant, price-free columns, and quietly closed it again. He noticed. What? She smiled, a little awkward now, a little exposed. I think one steak here costs more than my monthly salary. He took the menu gently from her hands. Order. I'll have water. The food. The water comes with the food. He looked at the hovering waiter. Bring one of everything. Her eyes went wide. One of every, she lowered her voice to a fierce whisper. Are you feeding me or opening a restaurant of my own? The waiter had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing out loud. As dinner went on, something in the atmosphere softened, the way ice softens at the edges when no one's watching closely enough to stop it. For the first time, they simply talked, not negotiated, not performed, just talked. She discovered he hated small talk with the particular violence of a man who'd spent his whole life trapped in it. He discovered she couldn't stay serious for more than 30 seconds without some small joke slipping out. A defense mechanism worn so smooth by years of use it had become simply her voice. She dropped her fork. He handed her another without a word, without making it a moment, which somehow made it one anyway. She caught him watching her once openly and said, What? You smile differently. She frowned. There are different types. Yes. Which one is this? The real one. She looked away before he could see the warmth climbing into her cheeks. When dinner ended, rain had begun outside, a soft, steady fall against the windows. Neither of them had brought an umbrella. Precious sighed. Perfect. Without a word, he removed his suit jacket and settled it gently over her shoulders, the fabric still warm from his body. She looked up at him. What about you? I don't get cold. Liar. I've been called worse. They stood together beneath the restaurant's awning, watching the rain fall in silver threads through the streetlight, and for one long, suspended moment the world around them seemed to disappear entirely. No family, no judgment, just two quietly lonely people who had, against every probability, found each other in a ballroom built for cruelty. She turned toward him. "Why me?" His answer, when it came, was quiet, almost reluctant, as though he hadn't planned to say it aloud. "Because when everyone in that room looked at your scar," he reached out, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that didn't match anything anyone had ever whispered about him in the dark corners of Seoul. "You were the only one looking at everyone else's pain." Her breath caught somewhere in her chest. The rain grew heavier around them, drumming against the awning. She whispered, "You're making it very difficult to keep arguing with you." "I know." They stood impossibly close now, close enough to hear each other breathing, close enough that neither of them could have said afterward who leaned in first. Their lips met, soft, gentle, brief, the kind of kiss that asked permission instead of simply taking it. When they finally pulled apart, neither spoke for a moment. Then Precious cleared her throat. "Well," he waited. I was expecting dangerous men to kiss with more confidence." He blinked. "Critiquing my technique?" She grinned, mischief flooding back into her, like color returning to a photograph. "I'm just saying, for a man feared by all of Korea, that was surprisingly polite." For the first time, Kang Tae-hyun actually laughed, a low, genuine sound, unpracticed and a little rusty, like a door swinging open on hinges that hadn't moved in years. His bodyguards froze where they stood. His assistant, jogging up belatedly with an umbrella, nearly dropped it. The boss laughed. 3 weeks passed, and Seoul could speak of nothing else. Photographs of Kang Tae-hyun walking a scarred, unfamiliar woman out of the city's most exclusive ballroom had found their way onto every gossip column in the country, accompanied by furious speculation about who she was, where she'd come from, and what kind of spell she had cast on a man known for feeling absolutely nothing. Precious had stopped reading the headlines after the third day. There was only so much of her own face, frozen mid-laugh beside him, that she could look at before the old instinct to disappear started clawing its way back up her throat. Instead, she let herself be folded slowly, carefully into his world. Dinners that stretched late into the night, quiet mornings on his terrace, coffee going cold while they argued cheerfully about nothing at all. A man who, it turned out, listened far more than the newspapers ever gave him credit for, and who had begun, without either of them quite noticing when it started, to rearrange his entire schedule around the hours she was free. It was at one of his family's formal dinners, held in the kind of private dining hall reserved for people who needed to be reminded who truly held power in a room, that her sister made her second attempt. Adiz had worn red that night, a dress cut for exactly this purpose, and she had positioned herself directly across from Tae-hyun before Precious had even finished greeting the host. "Mr. Kang," she said, voice low and warm, "I think we got off on the wrong foot at the gala. Let me make it up to you." She reached across the table, fingers grazing his wrist as she refilled his glass with a wine she hadn't been asked to pour. "My sister is sweet, but she doesn't understand men like you the way I do." Tae-hyun looked down at her hand on his wrist with the same flat. Assessing patience, he gave contracts he had already decided to reject. "What is it you think you understand?" Adi smiled, certain she'd found her opening. "Power, ambition, the kind of woman who knows how to stand beside a man like you without embarrassing him." Across the table, Precious felt the old, familiar heat rise in her chest, the heat of being measured and found smaller. Yet again, beside the sister everyone had always preferred. She said nothing. She had learned long ago that saying something only ever made it worse. Tae-hyun set his glass down with quiet, deliberate precision. "I've built an empire out of knowing exactly what I want the moment I see it," he said, his voice carrying easily across the sudden hush at the table. "I have never once been confused about it, since the night I chose your sister." He looked at Adiz without unkindness, but without an inch of give either. You mistake confidence for substance. I don't. He turned, unhurried, and reached for Precious's hand beneath the table, lacing his fingers through hers in full view of everyone watching. I'm not embarrassed by the woman beside me. I never have been. Adi's smile died slowly, the way ice dies in sunlight, and for the first time in years, Precious watched her sister have absolutely nothing clever to say. Later, walking out into the cool night air, Precious laughed quietly to herself. You really told her off in front of the whole family. She insulted you at your own family's table. I don't tolerate that, regardless of whose name is on the invitation. She glanced at him sideways. You know, most men would have at least pretended to be flattered. I'm not most men. No, she agreed softly, something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest. You're really not. A week later, he invited her to a charity gala hosted by his own family, the first event he had ever asked her to attend, not as a curiosity for the press, but simply as his. The ballroom that night glowed gold and quiet, an orchestra playing something slow near the center of the floor where a handful of couples turned in unhurried circles. Precious stood at the edge of it, watching, the old instinct to make herself small, rising up out of habit. Tae-hyun appeared at her side without a word and extended his hand. Dance with me. She glanced toward the floor, toward the elegant, effortless couples already moving across it. I haven't danced properly since I was a girl. Then I'll remind you. She hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. He led her onto the floor with a steadiness that surprised her, his hand settling warm and certain against the small of her back. She stumbled once, early, laughing under her breath. I did warn you. You did. He didn't let go, simply adjusted his pace to hers, patient in a way nothing about his reputation had prepared her for. Relax, he murmured near her ear. I have you. And somehow, impossibly, she did relax, her body remembering rhythms she hadn't trusted herself with in years. The two of them turning slowly beneath the chandelier light, while half the room pretended not to watch. You're staring, she whispered partway through the song. I'm allowed to. Is that a rule somewhere? I made it tonight. She laughed, the sound rising up out of her freely, without calculation, without bracing for what might come after it. You know, she said, for a man who claims he doesn't smile, you've been doing an awful lot of it around me. I'm aware. Bothered by it? Terrified by it, he admitted quietly, and the honesty in his voice stopped her breath entirely. They turned once more beneath the light, and for the length of that single song, neither of them was anything other than two people falling, slowly and without permission, into each other. When the music finally slowed to a close, he didn't step back right away. His hand lingered at her waist, his forehead nearly resting against hers. Precious. I want you to know something. That's an ominous way to start a sentence. He almost smiled. I've spent my whole life being told what I should want. Power, position, a wife who photographs well and says nothing inconvenient at dinner. His thumb traced once, gently along the edge of her hand. You are the first thing I've ever wanted simply because I wanted it, not because it served anything, not because anyone told me to. Her eyes burned with sudden, unexpected tears. That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me, and you said it like you were reading a quarterly report. I'm working on it. You're improving. I had an excellent teacher, he said, and kissed her there on the dance floor, slow and unhurried, while the orchestra began another song and neither of them noticed. It happened on a quiet evening weeks later, the two of them curled together on the long sofa in his study, rain tapping softly against the windows the way it had the night they first kissed. The lights had been dimmed low, a single lamp glowing warm in the corner, and for once neither of them had anywhere else to be. Precious had grown unusually quiet, her fingers tracing slow circles against the back of his hand, and Tae-hyun, who had learned to read the smallest shifts in her silence the way other men read financial statements, set his book aside. "You're somewhere else," he said gently. "Where did you go?" She didn't answer right away. The rain kept falling. Finally, she said very quietly, "Do you want to know why I have this?" Her fingers rose to the edge of the scar along her cheek, a gesture so old and automatic she barely noticed herself making it anymore. He went very still beside her. "Only if you want to tell me." "I've never told anyone," she admitted. "Not properly. Not the whole thing." He simply took her hand and waited, offering nothing but the quiet, steady patience that had become, somehow, the safest thing she'd ever known. "I was 8, she began, her voice small in a way it never was when she was joking, when she was performing the version of herself that knew how to survive a room. "My mother had promised to take me somewhere that weekend, somewhere I'd been begging to go for months, and at the last minute she had to cancel because of something with my father's business. I didn't understand things like that back then. I only understood that she'd promised, and then she hadn't kept it." She swallowed hard. I was so angry. The kind of angry only a child can be, where the whole world feels like it's ending over something small. I locked myself in my room and I wouldn't come out, and I knocked over the candle I'd been using for a school project, and I didn't even notice until the curtains had already caught. Taehyun's grip on her hand tightened, careful, grounding. By the time I smelled the smoke, the door was already too hot to open from the inside. I was screaming. I remember screaming so loud my throat hurt for a week afterward. Her voice cracked, and she pressed on anyway, the way she always did, the way she'd learned to push through every hard thing rather than let it stop her. My mother broke the door down herself. She got me out. She wrapped herself around me going through the hallway because the ceiling near the staircase had already started coming down, and she made sure I went out the window first, into my father's arms, before she tried to follow. A long, terrible pause. She never made it to the window. The floor gave way before she could. Precious closed her eyes, tears sliding silently down over the old scar that had started it all. My father has never once said it was my fault, not directly. He's never had to. Every time he looks at this scar, I can see exactly what he's thinking, even now. And I've spent my whole life agreeing with him in the privacy of my own head, because how could I not? I was the reason she had to run into that fire in the first place. She finally looked up at Taehyun, bracing, the way she always braced, for the flinch she'd learned to expect from anyone who heard the truth of it. It never came. "You were 8 years old," he said quietly, fiercely. "You knocked over a candle during a moment of ordinary, forgivable, childish anger. That is not what killed her. What killed her was loving you enough to walk through fire without hesitating." His thumb brushed gently beneath her eye, catching a tear before it could fall further. "She didn't die because of who you were. She died proving who she was. And I think if she could see you now, she would be furious that you've spent every year since then punishing yourself for her choice instead of honoring it." Precious made a sound that was half sob, half disbelieving laugh, and pressed her face against his chest, his arms closing fully around her as the rain kept falling outside. "I've never told anyone the whole story," she whispered against him. "Not even my father knows. I remember it, that clearly. Then I'm grateful you trusted me with it." "You didn't flinch." "I never will," he said, and meant it so plainly that she believed him without needing a single bit of proof. They stayed like that a long while, her tears slowly easing, his hand moving in slow, steady circles against her back, until the storm outside softened into a gentle patter and something inside her, something that had been clenched tight for nearly 2 decades, finally quietly let go. You know," she said eventually, voice thick but lighter now. "I always thought if anyone ever heard the real story, they'd look at me differently. I do look at you differently now." Her heart stuttered. Differently how? "I didn't think it was possible to admire you more than I already did." He tilted her chin up gently. "I was wrong." She laughed, wet and surprised, swiping at her own eyes. "You're going to make me cry again. I have tissues and time, both unlimited for you." She kissed him then, slow and grateful. A kiss that held none of the playful teasing of their first one, and all of the quiet certainty that had grown steadily between them ever since. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his, breathing him in. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not looking away." "I could never," he said. "Not from you. Not from any part of you." Spring arrived in Seoul wrapped in cherry blossoms, and with it came a change in Precious that even she hadn't fully noticed until her cousin pointed it out one afternoon over coffee. "You laugh differently now," her cousin said. "Looser, like you've put something down." Precious had thought about that for a long while afterward, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over most things that mattered, and had eventually decided her cousin was right. She had put something down. Years of it. Actually, set gently aside the night, she'd finally told the truth out loud and watched the person she loved most simply hold her through it instead of stepping back. Tae-hyun proposed on a Tuesday of all days, in the same study where she'd told him everything, the lamp glowing the same warm gold, rain tapping the windows in what had quietly become their favorite kind of weather. He didn't kneel with practiced ceremony or summon photographers to capture the moment. He simply took her hand mid-conversation, paused, and said, "Marry me," as though it were the most obvious sentence in the world, one he'd simply been waiting for the right, ordinary moment to say. She'd laughed so hard she nearly missed the ring entirely, an antique band he'd had quietly restored after learning, in passing, that her own mother had once worn something similar. "You remembered that detail." "I remember everything you tell me. Even the boring parts. Especially those." She'd said yes before he'd even finished opening the box. Her father, to everyone's surprise, including his own, asked to walk her down the aisle. It had taken 3 long conversations and more honesty than either of them were used to offering each other before Precious agreed, and even then only after he'd said the words she had waited her whole life to hear, plainly without an audience to perform them for. "I blamed a child for an accident, when I should have simply grieved your mother and held onto you tighter instead of pushing you away. I am sorry. I have been sorry for a very long time and too proud to say it." She had cried in his arms for a long while that day, the same way she'd once cried in Tae-hyun's, and had finally felt something settle between them that years of silence had never managed to fix. The wedding itself was held in the gardens behind Tae-hyun's estate, strung from end to end with hundreds of paper lanterns that glowed soft amber as the sun went down, casting warm light over rows of white chairs and an aisle lined with cherry blossom petals. Precious wore ivory, her scar uncovered, catching the lantern light the way everything in that garden seemed to. She had debated, briefly, wearing the scarf out of old habit, and had decided, finally, decisively against it. Some things, she had realized, deserved to be seen exactly as they were. Her sister Adiz stood among the guests that evening, and when their eyes met across the garden, something unspoken passed between them. Not quite an apology, but close enough to one that Precious chose, for the first time in years, to accept it as such. Family, she had learned slowly, didn't always arrive perfect. Sometimes it simply arrived, eventually in whatever broken, imperfect shape it could manage, and you decided what to do with what was left. When her father walked her down the aisle, his hand trembled slightly in hers, the same hand that had once pointed accusingly across a ballroom, now simply holding on. At the end of the aisle, Tae-hyun stood waiting in a dark suit, his expression doing very little to hide what he clearly felt, an unguarded softness that the tabloids would never have believed possible from the man they'd spent years calling cold. Her father placed her hand in his, and for a long moment neither of the two men said anything at all, an entire reckoning passing silently between them. "Take care of her," her father finally said, voice rough. "I intend to spend the rest of my life proving I will," Tae-hyun answered, and meant it completely. The ceremony itself was simple, brief, exactly the way they'd both wanted it. When it came time for vows, Precious found she'd thrown away the version she'd written the night before, the careful, polished one, in favor of something truer. "I spent most of my life believing I was something to apologize for," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the hushed garden. You're the first person who ever made me feel like I was something to choose instead. I choose you back every single day for as long as you'll let me. Tae-hyun, who had never once in his adult life cried in front of another person, did not entirely manage to hide it now. I built walls around every part of myself for 32 years, he said quietly, convinced that was the only way to survive in the world I was born into. You walked straight through every one of them without even trying, simply by being exactly who you are. I don't want walls anymore. I want a home. I want it with you. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that, for once, were not entirely steady. When they finally kissed as husband and wife, the garden erupted into applause beneath a sky gone deep violet, lanterns swaying gently overhead in the evening breeze. Precious laughed against his mouth, joy spilling out of her in a way she'd spent years not allowing herself to feel so openly. We did it, she whispered. We did. I believe you owe me a dance, she said, eyes bright with mischief even now. I believe I do. He led her out beneath the lanterns as the small orchestra began to play, the same patient, certain hold at her back that had steadied her the very first time he'd asked her to dance, and they moved slowly together while their families watched, while old grief quietly made room for something new, while the woman who had once tied a scarf over her face every morning out of habit stood in the open evening light with nothing left to hide. Do you remember, she murmured against his shoulder as they turned slowly beneath the glow, the first time you told me you saw proof I survived, instead of a reason to look away? I remember every word I've ever said to you. I think that was the night I started falling in love with you, even if I didn't admit it for weeks afterward. I knew, he said simply. How? Because you stopped flinching when I looked at your scar. You used to brace for it. That night, you didn't. She pulled back slightly to look at him, eyes shining. You really do notice everything. Only the things that matter. She kissed him again, slower this time, certain, the kind of kiss that no longer needed permission because it had already been given 1,000 times over in every quiet evening, every honest conversation, every moment he had chosen to stay instead of looking away. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and the lanterns had burned low, the two of them sat together on the same terrace where it had all somehow begun, her head resting against his shoulder, his arms settled around her the way it always did now, as naturally as breathing. I used to think love meant finding someone who didn't notice the worst parts of you, she said quietly into the dark. I think it actually means finding someone who notices everything and stays anyway. Then I suppose, he said, pressing a slow kiss to her hair, we've found exactly that in each other. Above them, the last of the lanterns swayed gently in the night air, and below them Seoul glittered on, indifferent and vast, while two people who had each spent a lifetime believing they were too much or not enough finally, quietly, settled into the simple, astonishing fact of being chosen completely for exactly who they were.